Welcome back to the Fight Sites podcast. This week we will be discussing Damian Lillard and his 48-point game against the Lakers, as well as his 51-point game the following night against the Jazz. So he has really been on fire.
I'm sorry, I don't really follow baseball.
Yeah, soccer's not really my thing. Sorry, guys.
No, but seriously, we need to address the. I needed to address the formal complaint that was lodged against our website from last week.
Yeah.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, I think we need a formal apology is in place. I still
Whoever
can't
got
believe
fired-
that happened.
I'm sorry, if you got fired, we're not
bring everyone
liable.
in on what we're talking about. We received a complaint on our YouTube video, the last podcast Sriram and Danny did. Some guy played it at his work without headphones in, and the first thing he heard was "swallow or spit, girl," and he got fired. His girlfriend dumped him. He's been arrested now. So
Trust fund empty.
we're very
He contracted
sincerely
severe
sorry.
medical problems.
Oh man, that was amazing. That was like the first ill word that anyone had anything to say about the site, and it like could not have been better.
Yeah,
It
he
really
said it in
makes
his sleep and his
everything worth it,
girlfriend
doesn't
broke up with him.
I don't know what that was about, but like that was amazing. So we'll do a millionaire matchmaker episode just for him, and I hope he comes back to listen to it. More seriously, today we don't have a whole ton to address because this week's pay-per-view is really not strong in the slightest. And besides, Sriram and I already talked about Ige and Bektic last week, so we are going to be doing a big, exhaustive discussion on Jon Jones versus Dominic Reyes, which is the main event this week at UFC. Is it 247, I think?
Yeah, it is.
Yes.
247? All right. And then after that, we have a couple of questions from our Patreon subscribers. One from Daniel DeMarco about cardio in MMA, and one from Sandro about how his parents don't love him. So we have a busy schedule, and I think we're gonna jump in with the main event, the main topic, because
Before we
we've.
get to
Sandra?
Oh, go ahead.
Before we
Go
get
ahead,
to
Ryan.
the Jones Reyes thing, I want to address something you said earlier. I feel like a lot of us, I've heard like a lot of you guys, Sriram and Danny and our coworkers talking shit about this card. And I feel like we're kind of sleeping on it a bit, in the sense that you check out the Wikipedia page and see everybody who's fighting, and it's a struggle not to immediately fall asleep.
Oh, good one. Wow. Did you make the
Very
D40
original.
account? That was that was some high quality.
Oh,
Welcome to
come
the
on.
comedy hour. For
That's-
the MMA comedy hour. I bet we could probably do that, honestly. We
Just
talk
make a
shit
stand-up
about
show.
enough fighters that I bet we could make that happen if we wanted to.
Yeah, like,
Wait till
I mean,
Holmes
first
fighting
on the
again.
list would probably be someone who isn't a brand new account. If we're going to talk shit about other people who aren't fighters.
Yeah. Truly.
Hey, more like MMA sucker, am I right? Ha ha ha.
Oh yeah, that was a hard one to tell people that I wrote for. MMA sucker, and they're like, "Oh, cool." I was like, "Yeah, it's really not."
I lied.
You just lied. Yeah, I probably should have lied too. I just say like, "Oh yeah, an MMA website." Okay, without further ado, Jon Jones, Dominic Reyes. I think we need to frame this. I was talking to Sriram before Ryan joined the chat. I think we need to frame this a specific way, which is like, first of all, kind of where is Jon Jones at, and why is it still difficult to beat Jon Jones? And I think we need to go deeper than just light heavyweights are bad. We know that. We've said it a lot on Twitter, but like, what is it specifically about Jon Jones's stylistic evolution that has made him tougher? Like, he's still just difficult to beat. He's still a hard person to win 5 rounds over. So what are your thoughts on that, Ryan?
Well, I think there's a couple of reasons that. So the topic right now is how Jones has evolved and why he's still seen as unbeatable, even though we don't rate him quite as highly as we did before. So first, to give you an overview of how Jones has changed. He used to be an absolute monster in the clinch. And you hear people talk about how Jones has legendary distance management. And he does have good distance management, but a very essential part of that was his clinch game. He's not the kind of guy who can just like be a really great striker at range. He doesn't have extremely nuanced footwork on the outside. He has an array of linear kicks and round kicks that work well to keep guys outside, but he's not the kind of guy who can just enforce that distance against somebody who's crafty, who's thoughtful. But the thing is that if you try to walk Jones down, you end up in his clinch and you end up drowning. We saw that with Daniel Cormier, himself one of the better clinch fighters at light heavyweight and heavyweight. He would try to walk Jones down because he couldn't compete with him on the outside. He would have to march through body shots in order to get there. And as soon as he did, he'd be met with a clinch where Jones would wreck him. His clinch game is pretty unique in MMA. He doesn't have the kind of tie-based clinch you see a lot. He doesn't use collar ties as his kind of main control position very much. He likes to control wrists, kind of like a Greco-Roman based clinch, and he works off the double wrist control really well. In his prime, in his better days, you would see him holding the guy's wrist down and working elbows off that, working his double leg, and that allowed him to take people down off the cage pretty reliably too, because he'd pin the wrists down and then get in on a double leg so they couldn't use their arms to frame or whizzer or grip fight since they were trapped. But what's happened recently, he's become a lot less potent in the clinch. And that kind of collapses a lot of what he's good at. So in the Anthony Smith and the Thiago Santos fights, you saw him coming forward and walking him down. And a lot of that was Jones wasn't so much pressuring them, but they seemed to assume that they needed to back up. And a lot of guys in his prime would need to back up, because if you try to meet him with force, then you'll end up in the clinch and he'll beat you up. But his clinch skill set has been degrading a lot recently. He's not as athletic as he was. You've seen Thiago Santos and Anthony Smith both kind of muscle him off of them from over-under, which isn't something that you would have expected from Jones in the clinch. He's a lot less offensively potent. It took him 3 rounds to really figure out how to get to Anthony Smith in the clinch, which is a pretty big indictment of his modern clinch game.
Concerning.
Yeah, absolutely. And Thiago Santos was able to completely throw him off doing anything in the clinch just by spamming punches. And part of the reason this is so bad is that he no longer has any kind of consistent entries to the clinch. When guys do walk him down, he'll do the thing where he extends his hands and kind of backs up in a straight line. Sometimes he'll angle off, but he's more focused on getting out than he is on any kind of reactive clinch entries. And on the front foot, he's not comfortable entering the clinch anymore. Like I said, Santos would just kind of spam punches and Jones would freak out and run away. The only consistent clinch entry he has nowadays is shooting a double leg from outside and then running his man onto the clinch. He can't finish the double leg for a multitude of reasons. His wrestling, again, has degraded a lot along with his clinch game. He can no longer consistently take mediocre defensive wrestlers down. He hit 2 takedowns on Anthony Smith, and he tried a lot more than that. If you want a more detailed breakdown of that, our colleague Ed Gallo wrote one for Bloody Elbow about how Jones's offensive wrestling has been degrading. But yeah, so he can't reliably take these guys down. He can't do too much offensively in the clinch, and he has real trouble getting to his clinch positions. So now he's at the point in his career where he's mostly a distance striker. He's not a big clinch wrestler kind of guy anymore, and he's just not that great at distance striking. He has an array of kicks. He's very good at linear kicks. He uses them not so much to back guys up, but when guys are stranded at range and having trouble getting in on him, he can pick at them with those linear kicks. He has some round kicks, although he's not a great round kicker. Santos was able to mostly avoid them. He didn't even have too much success against Anthony Smith with them, although I believe he didn't try too much. But in terms of his offense, it's basically that. It's his linear kicks, some round kicks, and he'll step into the pocket occasionally with elbows, setting them up off hand traps. But he's a lot it's the same with his clinch game. He's a lot less potent with them. He no longer, it seems his setups have degraded. If you watch the Rashad Evans fight, he's doing all kind of crazy hand traps into elbows. But now he seems a lot less comfortable just being close, being within his opponent's punching range. And as for why light heavyweights still haven't found much success against him, aside from light heavyweight bad, which we all know, I think a big part of it is that there's two main things, I think. For one, I don't know if they've realized how much different of a fighter he is now.
That's a good observation.
So if you look at the Santos and Smith fights, they seem to treat him like they couldn't be in range with him. He ended up playing an effective pressure game, although he did nothing to force them back. He was picking away with those linear kicks, but he was doing it when they were already stuck at range. He wasn't really hitting them reactively. Like it wasn't a thing where they would try to come in, they'd get speared with a front kick or with an oblique kick, and then they'd back off. When they came in, he was mostly just backing out. But they treated him like they couldn't afford to be in the pocket, like they couldn't afford to fall into his clinch, even though recently there hasn't been much of an indication that that's true. And I think the second big reason is that light heavyweights are bad, but they're bad in a specific way that makes it very difficult for them to beat Jones. So let's look at how Jones prevents his opponents from doing things. He obviously has the kicks for the distance management, but he's a very bad boxer. Boxing is not in his skill set, and his game is kind of built around limiting boxing exchanges. And the way he does this is by, first of all, hand fighting, extending his hands, tying up his opponents, and controlling them while he works inside with his knees and elbows and long kicks. And when opponents step in and try to put punching combinations on him, he will frame off. He extends his hands, he extends his lead arm. With his rear arm, sometimes he'll have it up in the air, sometimes he'll have it guarding by his head, and he usually backs up. So his go-to thing is to deny the pocket by framing and backing up. This works well against the competition he's fighting because they don't have nuanced boxing. If you look at the Santos fight, Santos would spam punches like a wild man. There was no craft, very little thought to how he was doing it. He wasn't setting anything up. He wasn't seeing the openings Jones presented and reacting to them.
Just throwing.
He was just kind of, he was just going wild. Smith never really got the confidence to even try throwing punching combinations at Jon. If you even go back to the Gustafsson fight, who had a lot of success with this, the amount of success he could have was limited because his jab was working well. He would move laterally, feint around, and set up entries, and then he would jab Jones up, moving in and out. But after he jabbed, he would when he went to throw his left hook, he would lean down at the waist and kind of take all the power off of it. So the left hook would be a slapping hook that didn't hit hard, and it would kill his positioning to follow up with the combination. If we're looking at what kind of fighter would be well equipped to deal with somebody who kind of frames off in a static guard like that, it's not responsive. He isn't so much seeing the openings and responding to them as he is throwing up a catch-all defense that he assumes his opponent's punches are going to run into. He has some reactive defense, like he can slip a shot or two on the outside, but he's not adjusting to deep exchanges. So if we think of the fighter that is most equipped to tear those kind of guards apart, it's a slick boxer. A good combination puncher, somebody who can use throwaway shots to draw responses and then take advantage of those responses. You see Jones's guard a lot in the sport of Muay Thai, and if you watch a Wang Chinoy fight or a Virapal fight, they're both great boxers, great combination punchers. And you'll see guys go to those long guards and they'll tear them up. They'll shoot rapid lead uppercuts underneath and then hook over the head. They'll bang the body. They'll go left hook to the body, left hook to the head, lead uppercut, and then throw the rear hand. There's all these kind of complex combinations you can use to manipulate the guard and to find the cracks in it. But everybody either just kind of rushes at him or throws one or two pot shots and tries to get out. And when you look at the landscape of light heavyweight, they don't have those guys. They don't have guys I don't need to go to an elite fighter. I can say they don't have guys like Jimmy Rivera who can feint in and out, who can draw counters, who can find those openings and work combinations. It's not a skill set that exists at the heavier weight classes. All right, I think that's my piece for now.
That was pretty comprehensive. Sriram, do you want to add something?
Not really. I think it comes down to light heavyweights being bad. In I think there are things that, well, for one, Thiago Santos arguably beat him even while being bad in a Thiago Santos sort of way, and I think that's what gives, and this probably spoils at least me and Danny's tentative picks. It kind of gives hope for someone like Dominic Reyes to at least do some work, in the sense that he's shown issues, but not necessarily in a way that's dissimilar to what Thiago Santos does. So you kind of get like, even if you don't rate someone like Renato Moicano particularly highly, it's unlikely that he'd struggle too much with Jon Jones. You don't even need a slick boxer to deal specifically with the weakness that Ryan brought up. You can deal with Jon Jones not knowing how to deal with an outside kicker. Or you can go with Jon Jones not knowing how to really come forward effectively, even against Thiago Santos, who is pretty notably not that good on the back foot. Like Dave Branch just wiped him out on the back foot. So there are a lot of things that you could do with Jon Jones. It's light heavyweight. And I think it's all going to come back down to that as to why Jones is hard to beat. It's that, I mean, you have some things that like people at any division might struggle with, because most people aren't used to fighting at a weight class and having someone who's like really big and really long and having to deal with that. But fundamentally, it just comes down to people at light heavyweight not really having skills as much as they do in areas of lack of glaring weakness.
Yeah.
And Jones
I
does have
Oh, go ahead, Ryan.
Jones does have like certain skills he uses to mitigate these things that, like, most guys, if Thiago Santos spams punches on them, they'll eat a lot more, and they'll, like Jack Hermanson. Hermanson's not a bad fighter at all. He's not a bad boxer, and Santos kind of just went wild and like plonked him out in round one. But Jones, I was talking about how the mitigation tactics he uses, like framing and stiff arming and all that, are very exploitable, but they also work. So it's not exactly easy to get in and rough him up, but somebody who's like actually good should be able to do a lot more work than his opponents have. Go ahead, Danny.
Yeah, I think I agree with just about everything that was said. One thing that I want to add that is interesting, kind of an interesting to prognosticate over with Jones, is directionality. Because Ryan, you pointed out that Jones was able to force Smith and Santos back with nothing. And I don't think it wasn't in a kind of like measured, sort of like Romero Rockhold sort of way, where he was just constantly stepping in just past Rockhold's area of comfort. So, Rockhold would constantly kind of step back. Like Jones could just walk them down, and they just kind of accepted that. Like there aren't many fighters with that much, craft on the back foot. But it is notable that Thiago Santos has, or demonstrated some at least like basic lateral movement on the outside.
Yeah.
Where he was someone who could circle both directions. He was someone who could, he would kick and then he would move, and he wasn't just static. Like he may be plotting, but he was never static. And the other thing with that was that it was kind of an interesting like push-pull in terms of the directionality of that fight, because Jones would walk Santos to the cage with just about nothing. But Jones was always reticent about really opening up against Santos, because he knew that that if he overcommitted to something, and Santos could have just clacked him. So he had to be extremely, extremely cautious. But he would walk him to the fence, and then when Santos wanted to launch into a punching combination, he would just rush at Jones with, clubbing both hands from the hips. Like, this is not boxing. This is just kind of linear path forward, clubbing with both hands, trying to catch him. And then John would always make sure he made a very concerted effort to not get hit in the face cleanly, like at least not more than once at a time. Like, as Ryan pointed out, it's not good defense. He's leaning way out of position. He's relying on pure foot speed off the back foot. Like he's sometimes even frames with one arm and completely turns his back to an opponent and just tries to get out of the exchange as quick as he can. But that seemed to take priority with him. And so but then when Santos pushed him back, Jones would then kind of walk him back to the fence. So it was constantly Santos being pushed to the cage and then blitzing out, and being pushed to the cage and then blitzing out. Combined with lateral movement on the outside, it meant that Jones really couldn't track him down. And so I am curious about Dominic Reyes, because I don't know if Reyes is going to concede range the same way. And I sort of wonder what it will look like if Reyes just kind of fences with Jones at mid-range, and he doesn't have to, Reyes doesn't just like sprint after Jones trying to, because Jones isn't a counter threat, right? Jones is not going to, he's not going to take advantage of someone who just rushes at him with a punching flurry. Like, he's not a kind of counter punching threat who can catch them on entry, or, take a slight angle and then clock them when they're out of position and they don't realize it. He's just trying to skirt away.
I have some thoughts on this. I think, unfortunately, Reyes is going to concede range pretty easily. He's very uncomfortable in close, and he always wants to be at like the end of his kicking distance. So much so that often his kicks land with the instep because he doesn't seem to want to be closer. Volkan, there was a few times Volkan was like actively pressuring him, like throwing double jabs or throwing shifting punches to get him to move back. But a lot of the pressuring he was doing in that fight was just like Reyes pressuring himself. Volkan would like kind of move around on the outside, maybe step into the not into the pocket, but like into the edge of his range, and Reyes would dart back like 2 steps. So I don't think Reyes is going to feel comfortable unless he's able to fight completely against type, which wouldn't be a bad idea here. But I don't know if he has the kind of mentality or comfort required to do that. I think it's going to be Jones walking forward and Reyes moving around on the outside. You brought up Santos's lateral movement, which was something he did really well. And another thing about that was he spent a lot of time in a square stance, kind of like feinting direction changes both ways. And that has some advantages and some disadvantages, but it worked quite well against Jones. In my Muay Thai podcast that came out on Tuesday, this podcast would already be out by then, I talked about how sitting on the ropes, or in this case the cage, in a square stance can make it hard for kickers to get at you. If you're fighting somebody who's like a boxing threat, like say Dave Branch, I guess, then he can pressure you back, collapse your stance, and bomb you, and you're not in position to deal with the punches or to take them. But for kicking, a square stance is pretty good, because if a guy's trying to kick you, if Jones is trying to throw his linear kicks, you can very easily move to the side because you have your weight distributed evenly between both legs. You can easily push off to either side. If he's trying to round kick you, again, you can sidestep it the way you would a linear kick, or it gives you like the balance to draw your legs up to check it, on either side. So where Santos kind of like squaring his stance when he backs up is usually bad, it worked pretty well against Jones because Jones isn't a puncher. He's not going to step in and blast you with the right hand. Dominic Reyes doesn't do that. He does have active lateral movement. He can circle both ways, although he favors the inside angle like most southpaws do. And he does feint direction changes too, which I like, but he won't be as active in feinting direction changes and switching directions as Santos was. So I do think there's some opportunity to Jones to kind of corner him off and lead him into kicks, or especially if he gets predictable with the circling, the spinning back kicks and stuff like that. But yeah, in general, I think it's going to be Reyes moving around on the outside and trying to maintain kicking distance, and Jones following him.
I think it helps Reyes a little bit, at least. That Jones, as you guys mentioned earlier, that Jones isn't really feeling all that enthusiastic to close distance into the clinch, or even really take advantage of the pressure he put on Santos. Because as you mentioned, like Santos did do some things that would make it hard to track him, but Jones also didn't really, even when Santos's both his legs were screwed up, Jones didn't really step in to do anything. He the most offense he musters was when Santos stepped forward right into an elbow. So I think Jones is kind of growing pretty reliant on his opponents needing to close distance more than Reyes might need to. And this is a point that a lot of people took away from the first Gus fight as well, which is that Jones is going to struggle when he can't just step back with the frame. And it might, like as Ryan mentioned, the guys at light heavyweight, Reyes included, aren't necessarily creative enough to take advantage of it as consistently as a good fighter would. But I think Reyes's kicking game might be the thing to substitute that a little bit.
I think that's kind of what we're saying here, is that the Santos fight is being particularly instructive. It's not the end all be all to this discussion, but it's a very helpful one. Yes, I don't think that Reyes doesn't have the same like foot speed as Santos, but he is a fair bit longer, and he's actually as tall as Jones is. And so he is, if Jones is gonna approach Reyes the same way, like he will be sort of engaging in an outside kicking match with someone who can at least match him in terms of size and, ostensibly strength. The one thing that I really want to bring up is that Jones never got the Santos fight under control. For someone who has been, like this is becoming what he does, right? Like this is how he's winning his fights. He's not, I think he's sort of built his style around his opposition a little bit in terms of Cormier and Gus. Like I think he's a fighter who would be favored over those fighters at just about any iteration, but that doesn't necessarily make him a better fighter in terms of dealing with the rest of the division. And he never like I said, he never really got the Santos fight under control. So I don't really know what kind of tactical adjustments Jones is capable of making at this point against someone who could, presumably kick his legs and potentially jab with him, move on the outside. What are your thoughts?
Yeah.
Oh, go
Go
ahead.
ahead. No, go ahead.
Okay. One thing I've heard a lot is that Jones felt that he had the fight under control, and that if Santos had like two good legs, or even one good leg, or even a half of a good leg, then he would have ramped it up and tried harder. But I just don't really see any reason to believe that. I think if he could have clearly won that fight, he would. And he just really didn't really seem to have like a well of tactics he could dig into. He was largely fighting the same fight that he was early by the end of the fight, but Santos was just a lot more crippled and a lot more tired from hobbling around on like 0.5 legs. So yeah, you hear a lot about Jones having amazing fight IQ, and it is true that when he finds he has some particular area of advantage, he's great at pushing it relentlessly. If there's something he does that you can't deal with it, he'll do it over and over again until you either die or you're forced to adjust. But I don't know if he's the kind of fighter that can like come back from not just a deficit, but come back from somebody competing with him like that. We saw in the Gus fight, he was losing the fourth round pretty heavily and then hit the spinning elbow, but that's not like so much of a tactical adjustment as it is him just doing a thing he always does.
The Hail Mary.
Yeah, he did it at the right time and it worked really well and it was smart and great, but it's not the kind of adjustment that's going to consistently bring him back from fights that he's seriously struggling in. So I don't really see that extra well of tactics that he can dig into. I think if he's struggling in a fight like he did against Santos with a similar matchup, I don't know if there's much he can do. We'll get into this later when we're talking about how the grappling shapes up, but I do think he could have a lot more success grappling Reyes than he did Santos. So I think that might be viable if he can shoot Reyes to the fence and get him down. But as far as the striking goes, if Reyes is giving him trouble like Santos was, I expect the fight to kind of keep that same shape unless Reyes gasses.
You have something you wanted to add?
No, I pretty much wanted to say the same thing. I think people tend to underrate fighters as like rational actors because people tend to, at least especially with Jones and especially with like really, really highly rated fighters, like for example, Khabib Iaquinta is another example where you have people going, the A side just didn't really give it their all. And it's something that you don't really see because like for example with Khabib Iaquinta, Khabib clearly won, but there were certain rounds where if he wanted to do better and if he could do better, he would have done better. And it's the same thing with Jones Santos, where Santos might not have been winning clearly and he might not have been hurting Jones, but he was clearly doing some damage and more so than Jones was. I don't think Jones has, at least now, because before he was, kind of wild and confident enough to take the sort of risks he'd need to bring a fight back if he needed to. But now I just don't really trust him to do the same. I think if the dynamic favors Reyes at the beginning, it's going to be Jones either getting the fight to the ground or just, hobbling to the end of a fight that he loses or barely wins.
So that's kind of where I'm at with this matchup because Reyes is still largely an unknown in a lot of ways. This is the problem with light heavyweight prospects is that they come in, they look solid in their sort of showcases. Maybe they look underwhelming against top 10 and then they sort of work their way to a title shot, but we haven't really, it's hard to kind of quantify any sort of growth or development we've seen from him. There is a chance that he is exactly who he's always going to be and he's just going to win some fights and lose some fights. And there's a chance that he could also make a serious leap for light heavyweight standards, but an actual leap in development and growth at the right time. We always have to kind of keep that in mind with fighters who are on the come up. The thing is that that's kind of what I can't fucking get around it. It's just this is how Jon Jones wins fights. Do you know what I mean? Like his style was weird a few years ago. Even 2015, 2016 analysts like Phil McKenzie and Ryan and we were saying things like Jon Jones has a weird style, and it's a style that isn't necessarily replicable for a lot of other fighters, shouldn't be replicable for a lot of other fighters. But kind of between the competition he's fighting and just with the way that it was sort of flowing together, it was kind of choppy, but at least he had moments that were where we could see his actual best areas shine. But
yeah,
we're past that now. We're at a point where his C game has become his A game. Because it used to be Jon was this incredible, this whirlwind from top position who would pretty much clobber and crush every single person who was beneath him. That was 2011 to 2013, 2014 Jones. Then it kind of became
on the ground at one point.
Yeah, he did.
He dominated Ryan Bader on the ground.
Imagine that.
Yeah.
The Ryan Bader. But then it kind of became Jon Jones, the clinch threat. And it's okay, that's okay. Maybe his top game isn't as much of an active part, but he is becoming a much more voracious clinch threat in attacking transitions. And he's, as Ryan said, he's using a pretty unorthodox kind of wrist control and posture game inside, and he was at least he was better at taking opponents' weapons away. If you watch the first Cormier fight and the Glover fight, he went to lengths to really kind of eliminate both of those guys' right hands, which was still impressive for what it was. But now, even that's eroded. We're at the point where Jones has to kickbox for 5 rounds with opponents, unless he can get a takedown, which he's kind of netted an extremely passive Anthony Smith and a shot to pieces Gustafsson he was able to take down. But if he can't get a takedown, and as his clinch game is also continuing to to erode, he has to fight 25 minutes kicking his opponents and maybe throwing an occasional jab, trying to run and frame off of his opponent's combinations, and he's just winning on pace. And like as the Santos fight indicates, he's not really that good at adjusting within this context. Like that, is that really how you're winning fights today? Do you get what I mean?
Yeah, I think it's something that you've mentioned before. I think it was one of the first things I read from you, Danny, was the Jon Jones DC preview, which is that Jones's game is built in a kind of weird way, and I think we're starting to see more fighters do that kind of thing, but in a more coherent way. I think a decent parallel, and it's one that's made a decent amount of times, is Leon Edwards at welterweight, which is that you can afford to be the sort of, I want to be either at distance or in the clinch type fighter. But the difference is, and Leon Edwards has like a similar kind of dynamic, whereas comparative advantage in the clinch is more than it is at range with a lot of his opponents. But for that, you need like really intentional clinch entries, which you can like do reliably. You need something to keep guys out of punching range if you can't clinch them. And for Jon Jones, it's just he's suffering from success in a way, in that he could just, when he was earlier in his career, he could just, athlete through people. He had the confidence in his chin. He had the, risk-taking tendencies both in and out of the cage, which meant that he could just sort of, run forward at people if he wanted to. He didn't really do that, but he could just get in contact with them and throw them on the ground and just smash the life out of them. And now that he's, sort of matured, quote unquote, he's turned into a fighter where he never developed the pieces to play that game coherently, and he's lost the ability to play that game athletically.
What do you think, Ryan?
Yeah, I agree with all that. I want to shift the discussion a little bit towards Dominic Reyes. We've been talking a lot about Jones, but we haven't kind of gone over the tools Reyes has that might be difficult for him. So the fighter I see in Reyes is he's a long southpaw kickboxer who plays kind of the traditional southpaw double attack game, where he'll flash his straight right and throw up his rear round kicks and look to play those off each other. But unlike a lot of southpaw kickboxers like Pettis, Krokop, or David Tamer, he is much more of a counterpuncher. He does his best work on the counter. The long rangy kicks seem almost more to force guys onto his hands to convince them to close distance so he can land counter punches than they do to actually to use as a ranged kickboxing game. He's not very good on the lead. When he's trying to throw his straight from outside, he keeps a very long distance, like I said, at the edge of kicking range, so his kicks are often landing with the instep. It's too far away for him to punch, and he doesn't work in range well. He's not going to like throw a double jab to close distance and then open up with his combos. He's not going to feint inside to get into like the pocket or a good boxing range and then like wait for his opponent to do something and throw a counter. Then he's attacking from kicking range or from the very edge of his reach. So he's overextending with his left hand, and it's in his fights against Uzdemir and even to some degree Ovin St. Preux, the left straight is pretty easy to read. He doesn't set it up well. He doesn't really disguise it. He just kind of throws it from too far away. He does somewhat of a good job drawing counters. He can flash his jab to convince his opponent to throw a straight and then slip that and land his own. But when he's trying to do his own work on the lead, it's just not very sound. It's not nearly as comfortable or savvy as he is on the counter.
It's also predictable.
And yes, it's very predictable. Volkan was able to time him consistently in counter. And I don't like his kicking game. He uses the head kick pretty well. He does the whole throw the straight to get them slipping and then throw the head kick to take advantage of it. And if they're waiting on the head kick, they'll keep their hand more to the outside of their head to block it, and then he can slip in the straight. But he has good leg kicks. I like the leg kicks, although, like I said, a lot of times they land with the instep because he isn't comfortable with his distance. His body kicking, I don't like it at all. From a technical standpoint, they're not very good. He doesn't really pivot or rotate on his foot. He doesn't put hip into it. And a lot of times he seems to aim it weird. Like often when he throws his kicks, I don't know whether he's targeting the head or the body, because he'll throw it kind of at the shoulder right onto his opponent's forearms, which is fine if you kick like a tie and you're pounding their forearms into dust. but he doesn't. He, like I said, he doesn't put hip into it. He doesn't pivot on his plant foot, so they don't land very hard. And they seem to exist more to like encourage opponents to close distance onto his counters rather than to actually work as a functional kickboxing game. And another thing is that he doesn't set them up. When Santos was having most of his success with the body kicks against Jones, they would be pushing him back with a punching combo and then doing it, or doing something tricky like switching stances and kicking the body. Reyes, I believe I saw him set up one single body kick against Ovin St. Preux, where he hop stepped in with a lead hook and then threw it, but mostly he's just chucking them out there without any kind of setup, which I don't anticipate being too difficult for Jones to deal with. There is the leg kicks that he could have success with, and as we saw in the Thiago Santos fight, Jones doesn't have much inclination to defend them, and he's not very good at it. He basically didn't counter Santos's leg kicks at all. Once or twice he'd throw like a linear kick to the leg and jam him off balance, but mostly he was just eating the kick or trying to back out, and Santos was able to slam them in freely. So I think Reyes will be able to work with those, but I don't anticipate him having too much success with the body. And coming into this fight, I thought that Jones would have a lot of trouble if he wanted to fight orthodox, because Reyes would be able to kick the body clean. I don't think that anymore, and I think that Reyes might have more to be worried about with Jones's body kicks than Jones has to be worried with his. And the fact that he's mostly a counterpuncher is an issue, because Jones probably just isn't going to try to punch him very much. And if
he might not. Yeah, he might not give Reyes anything. If Reyes is trying to feint to get a reaction or a response, Jones's whole style is kind of meant to mitigate those types of exchanges. So that's a good observation.
Yeah, exactly. So Jones, he's not going to be overextending on like the straight right, try and close distance with it, so Reyes can snipe the inside angle counter. That's not what he's trying to do. That's not his thing. So I don't think Reyes is going to have a lot of success drawing him into the area he works best. And his punching on the lead, like I said, it's predictable. He attacks from too far away, which is a big problem given Jones' range. First of all, given like just how long he is, and also his distance control, which is fairly good on the outside. If Reyes is just trying to work with single leg kicks, which he usually does, he doesn't set them up with his punches very well, there's a good chance that Jones will fade away and he'll have trouble landing with them, because his leg kicks aren't as clean or efficient as Santos's. So I don't expect him to be able to shock Jones with them as much as Thiago did. As for his punching, if he tries to lead, which he'll likely have to get his punches off, he throws them from too far away. He throws them in either pot shots or two-punch combinations, and he doesn't have the kind of boxing that is going to work against. He doesn't really have much boxing at all, except for on the counter. But specifically, his attack patterns kind of play into what Jones wants. If you're going to hit Jones rushing in from the outside, which is not the best way to hit him, but you need to come over the shoulder or you need to hit the body and then go up to the head, Reyes will, sometimes he has like a leaping left hook, but it's not very good. He doesn't hit people with it consistently. He'll like throw a 1-2, or he'll jab into his left hand. And those are the kind of punches Jones wants you to throw. First of all, because he can control your hands. He'll have his hands out, like fiddling with Reyes's and impeding the center line. And it naturally jams those straight punches if you're not close enough to throw them and if you don't have a good position. And Reyes isn't comfortable throwing like overhands or hooks. And he's also very uncomfortable working inside. So if he does throw the overhands or hooks, they're going to be from too far away. And I think Jones will be able to comfortably back out of range. And yeah, that about covers where I think the fight's going to go on the feet. I think that Reyes isn't a sharp enough kicker to outwork Jones at range, and that there's a good chance he'll be forced onto the back foot and accept kind of a slow-paced fight in which Jones is chucking a lot of volume of these non-committal linear kicks at him, and he's sometimes responding with his own kicks, but they don't do much. And he's not going to rack up much attritional damage. He's not that kind of kicker, and I don't think he's going to be able to play them into boxing threats. So I expect Jones, and one more thing is that Reyes moves a lot on the outside, And if the fight plays out the way I expect, he'll be the one circling the cage and moving a lot, while Jones will be doing a lot less work following him. Reyes he hasn't proven himself to be a gasser, but he does look quite visibly tired in the third round of some of his fights. And I don't know if he is having success kicking at range with Jones. I don't know if he can keep that up throughout the whole fight.
What do you
I
think,
think,
Sriram?
yeah, so I don't have the same read because, as I said before, I was thinking about picking Reyes, although Ryan makes some good arguments with what I said before about light heavyweights not exactly having areas of strength, but more areas where they can do work that doesn't make them completely fall apart. I think Reyes is an interesting sort of exception to that, in that compared to other light heavyweights, he's genuinely good in terms of fighting on the counter, and that's something that's very, very rare at light heavyweight. If you look at the best boxers that Jones has faced, it's Alexander Gustafsson and literally no one else. So Gustafsson's, oh my God, yeah, Cormier, the boxer. But yeah, I mean, even Cormier, we can consider him that for the purposes of this discussion because there's no one else that's even that close. And neither of them are particularly good counter threats. Gustafsson's pretty much incompetent as a counter puncher.
He can't counter at all.
Yeah, like John Blachowicz just sort of ran into him over and over doing the same thing. So if you look at it that way, I think Dominic Reyes is an interesting sort of challenge in like, oh, this is new and this is something that Jones hasn't seen before. And you could even see Jon Jones getting counterpunched. Like he got counterpunched once by Anthony Smith. And in general, when he tries to punch, it's open pretty much all the time. The Smith fight was a pretty awful example of anytime he tried to punch, it was these like really wide looping overhand stuff. So if he does that,
You nearly
I
fell
think
over.
Reyes, yeah, he stepped on Santos. He stepped on Smith's foot at one point. He stepped on his foot and like trying to shift, and it looked like Poirier trying to do it in his shower and like slipping everywhere. But like if he does that kind of thing, I think Reyes will be in position to like take advantage. But on the other hand, Jones knows that's not where his strengths are. And that's not the kind of thing that Jones does regularly. It's just more of a, oh, I'm feeling you out type of thing. In general, I think, yeah. So if you look at the Ovince St. Preux fight, it's one thing that's notable because Reyes is a pretty dedicated southpaw type fighter. And the southpaw orthodox dynamic reliant fighters tend to struggle when they face another southpaw. Kelvin Gastelum is probably the best example of that because he looked pretty much incompetent anytime any one of his opponents went southpaw. But Reyes had an answer to Ovince St. Preux doing that, which was just kick his lead leg over and over and over. It wasn't like crafty, but it was something that he could do to force Ovince St. Preux back into the setup where Reyes was most comfortable. Now, I think if Jones fights southpaw, that might be a pretty big problem. As I mentioned before, it was Thiago Santos trying to like burst into range that kind of gave him the cue to step back with his hand out, where Reyes can just kind of chuck them out without needing to close distances dramatically. So I think that might give him trouble. The body kicks, I didn't actually notice the thing that Ryan said about Reyes not being comfortable with his range on kicking in general, but I think that does make some measure of sense in that I think Jones can play this fight orthodox. It's just I'm not sure how comfortable either is by the idea of the other kicking, them. So I think I don't know whether this is the part of the thing where we do picks, but I think I'll stick with Reyes just on Jones seeming declined and on Reyes seeming like he can do some things that Jones empirically has trouble with, even if he's bad in other areas. And I think that's the best we can kind of hope for from light heavyweights because you're not, like, as much as we hope to see it happen, you're not ever going to see a Jimmy Rivera at light heavyweight. It's just not going to happen. So I think this is the best chance we're going to get to credibly pick against Jon Jones, and it's a chance I'm going to take.
Well, gentlemen, you both make compelling arguments. I hear both of you guys, honestly. Like I am not. It's hard to pick Reyes, not just for the tactical reasons listed, but one because Jones is just such a, he's just such a mercurial opponent, he's such a cerebral fighter that nobody really fights like him, and so it's hard for guys coming up to trust that they have the answers to someone who just fights the way that Jones does. For better or worse, as I said, I wanted to point it out. It's a hard one to predict, and it's also there's no guarantee that Reyes is going to be able to, or I think Reyes should replicate the Santos game plan. It's just that they are slightly different fighters, but those differences could be significant. But the thing is,
Reyes.
What is it, sir?
Reyes started fighting in like 2014. I just looked it up. So there is a chance he could make a leap here, which is like more than we would expect from like Thiago Santos too.
I feel like I just need to stick with Reyes, and it's like I know Jones is probably the smart pick, and like I would be very unsurprised to see him just look confused. Like that would not be a surprise in the slightest. It's just that I just can't trust Jones. I just don't really feel like I can trust Jones anymore. Like after the Santos fight and the Smith fight, if this is how he's gonna fight, he's gonna be leaving guys like Reyes and like Corey Anderson and like someone like Alexander Rakic. He's gonna be leaving guys like this in there for 5 rounds where they're probably going to be able to find success with something or another. I don't like the way that Jones is trending, and I don't think that his transitions as a fighter have been optimal in a way that are going to serve him. I just can't help but feel like we're kind of at the end of the line. So
I think,
there's a bit of a leap of faith, and I'm ready to look like an idiot. But and again, this may just be more of a philosophical pick, but I'm going to pick Reyes. And the last thing I want to say is that given the way that Jones has been trending, there's a small chance that Reyes could also just make this look really easy. If he really comes out and he's like, he actually has answers for Jones, and he's able to just like, somewhere between the spectrum of Gustafsson and Santos, Reyes is able to sort of find where he sits and just press his advantages. Like he could just make Jones look incredibly ordinary.
Yeah, I think you could sort of look at a high-level comparison, not really technically, because the guy I'm about to say is much better, but just in terms of like, depending on like just totally confusing opponents. If you look at someone like Dominick Reyes and his loss to Cody Garbrandt, I think you could kind of see that it may not take someone who's like actually able to deal with the entirety of his game to like, it won't take someone with no weaknesses to beat someone who's works off jank and like, just being like taking the initiative off someone. It might just take someone who's, able to take away the nodal points of his game. And as we saw, Cody Garbrandt's incredibly limited in ways that Dominick Reyes couldn't really show, in the way that Reyes might be really, really limited against other light heavyweights, because every light heavyweight is incredibly limited. But I think this is the kind of fight where you can say Jon Jones has shown the specific weaknesses to stuff that Reyes does high level, even if it's not necessarily in the stuff that Reyes does in like the little nitty gritty details. Because I mean, those do matter. Those matter a lot. But it's like, I think I'll trust Reyes at this stage of his career to get better. And at this stage, it's hard to trust Jones to get anything but worse.
I'm glad you guys turned in your Reyes picks before I started talking shit about his takedown defense, but I'm about to do that now. So he has a good base, and he is disciplined at getting back to his feet when guys take him down, but I do not like his technical takedown defense at all. He's all right at whizzering or underhooking and pulling up when he's able to get in on shots early, when like his opponent shoots and then he catches a whizzer or an underhook early. But in late stages of takedown defense, he does not grit fight at all. Chris Weidman kept a rear body lock on him basically for free. He would hang his left arm over to whizzer, and then his right arm would just be like kind of doing nothing. Or he'd be like pushing on the head, which is not there's not much utility to that in that position, and it allowed Weidman to get him down again. Um, Often he'll be in the clinch and he'll seem to not know what to do with his hands. He's very slow to whizzer a lot of times, and you'll see him just kind of having his hand either around the head or on the back of the head when he's pushed to the fence, or just kind of having it out. Like I'm not sure what he's doing with that, but it does not help him. It does not help him get off the fence or achieve any kind of leverageable clinch position or defend takedowns. So I think if Jones really wants a takedown, and if he's not liking the striking and feel like he needs to, and another thing is that he didn't feel comfortable taking down, even trying to take down Santos, and a lot of that seemed to be to do with like just Santos's wildness. Whenever he got into clinching range, Santos would just freak out. There was one point, I think, in the first round where Jones caught a kick, and Santos kind of showed his back, and Jones went in for a shot. Santos framed off of him and forced him back upright. And then Jones kind of thought about coming into the clinch, and Santos just freaked the hell out, and Jones backed away. I don't think Reyes is dumb enough for that to work. Like, if Jones wants to get in on him, I think he'll like try to snipe one or two counter punches, but I don't think he'll just like go wild. And I think that actually might be a better way to put Jones off grappling than patient counterpunching. If he tries to snipe a left hand when Jones works into range, Jones can reliably slip that or like frame off of it and then press into the clinch. Where if he's not worried about like a dozen follow-up shots. And also he can, if they're at range and Reyes is near the fence, which I expect him to spend a lot of this fight doing, Jones has a chance to duck in on his hips and shoot him to the cage. He did that. He used that as a clinch entry a lot against Gustafsson. He did it against Smith. And if Jones has him on the cage in that kind of double leg position, Reyes' only real line of takedown defense is like underhooking and being an athlete. If his hands aren't in good position, I don't trust him at all to whizzer and like frame off or to grip fight. If Jones gets any kind of good position against the cage, I think he'll be able to take Reyes down a lot easier than he took Santos or even Smith down. And if he isn't able to do that, but he can stick him in the clinch, I also don't trust Reyes to escape. When Anthony Smith had his back on the cage against Jones, early in the first 3 rounds, he was able to frustrate Jon in the clinch enough that he would back out of his own volition, but he wasn't really able to escape the cage. But what he would do is when Jones went to do his wrist control thing, he would fight the grip and then just kind of stall him out. But I don't think Reyes is the kind of guy that'll do that. I don't trust him to know what to do with his hands in the clinch. So if Jones is able to press him to the cage, I think he'll kind of be able to have his way with him, either by just kind of holding him from over under and picking away with like little knees, or if he wants to get into his more complex wrist control and elbow sequences. I think there is a lot of opportunity for him to do that. There is the point that Reyes is a better athlete certainly than Smith. He's probably a better athlete in some ways than Santos. He's not as explosive, I don't think, but I think he's quicker. I think he might be a little bit more physical in the clinch, but I don't trust his positioning for him to be able to consistently escape or defend well. For all the other reasons I've mentioned along with that, I am going to pick Jones. I favor Jones fairly confidently, but at this point, I'm with you guys that I don't trust Jones, and I wouldn't be terribly shocked to see him lose to anyone who's just a very willing kicker at range and has some boxing in the pocket that they can use on him just to prevent him from like comfortably stepping in and doing his elbow and clinchy thing. I would cap Jones probably around -200, but again, at this point, I wouldn't be terribly shocked to see him lose to kind of anybody that's at the level of like Santos and Reyes, but I don't think Reyes has the style to consistently make it happen. So I'm going to go with Jones by probably a pretty close but increasingly clear decision as the rounds go on.
Okay, well, our picks are in. Thanks for bringing everybody down, Ryan. But I think I think if our listeners can draw anything, is that we're all kind of reticent for this one. And Ryan and I have said to each other, there's really no reason to have a lot of faith in either man at this point. Don't bet on this fight. I don't know, but we don't really talk too much about betting.
The odds
really.
are good.
Yeah, well,
yeah, odds are good
well,
because if you cap it around minus 200, then Reyes is at like plus 370.
well, I'm trying to save our
There's
listeners
value on
money,
Reyes, but I also would not bet on him.
so don't bet on this fight.
Hey, I want to make the point that I did tell them to bet the house on Roxy, and then Roxy went out and dominated Macy Barber.
It's great to hear. So you're going to tell our listeners to bet on Reyes? Because that would be great right about now.
Don't bet on this fight.
Don't bet on this fight. I think we're good on this segment. We really kind of, like, I knew it was going to be an exhaustive discussion, but I think we talked about that for close to an hour. Let's move on to
discussion.
Yeah, it is exhausting. Watching Jon Jones is exhausting. He's so boring nowadays.
Speaking of exhausting, cardio.
Hey, what a transition. What a segue. Yeah, so do you guys have the specific question from Daniel?
Yeah, we should have done this before we started the podcast.
Definitely should have.
But
it's
find it in the Discord.
Okay, so I will describe what Daniel was asking of us.
I mean, we can start with the stuff
Which
that
is,
we knew he asked, which is
cardio in MMA.
Yeah,
and how it's changed. Who are the best examples of cardio? Personally, I think cardio is sometimes a little bit relative, because we'll get into the difference between just being able to keep a pace and actually being able to enforce a pace are not always the same thing. But it is also a vital component if you're going to be a fighter at the highest level. We can talk about someone who has shown a lot of solid pieces to their game, but is really lacking in the cardio equation, like Zabit Magomedsharipov, who just is ardently not being booked for 5-rounders for some reason. Sriram, what do you think?
Zabit's gonna rob Max in 3 rounds. I'm calling it right now. It's gonna be Zabit spinning around and Max just, taking his time.
The Volkanovski rematch.
Oh yeah, that's gonna be fun. But yeah, I think there's a difference between, and this is kind of similar to what you were saying. Like in jiu-jitsu, if you don't really need to have great cardio to be able to compete for a long time if you know when and where to take breaks. And I think that's kind of the thing with cardio and MMA, is that if you're in control of what's going on, you're going to have much better cardio. And I think this is one of the misconceptions that arose about Jose Aldo, is that if you look at the Mendez rematch, he had trouble, but he was in control of the engagements, which meant that he was able to go for 5 very, very hard rounds, even if it wasn't like the nonstop action of someone like Max Holloway, but it was a pretty high-paced fight where both guys had like a ton of exchanges. It's just Aldo knew when he could take a break. And I think that's one thing that someone like Colby Covington takes advantage of, is that it's not necessarily as massive a cardio disparity as it looks. It's just that he's kind of freaking people out into not breathing.
One of the interesting things about cardio is, we talk about cardio in terms of pace, and I just said it a minute ago, and I'll say it again. Being able to keep a pace and being able to force a pace are not necessarily the same thing. So, someone like Jon Jones, for instance, was lauded in his early career for being, just being able to enforce an insane pace, and he did. He had just a ton of output, and he would just constantly be on guys and forcing his game until, pretty much for the duration of every fight. But now he seems like someone who's a lot more, he's just a lot more willing to sort of control pace. And another example would be someone like Dominick Reyes. So Dominick Reyes is rarely dangerous in moments, almost never. He has phenomenal cardio in the sense that he can, he has great output. He can go 5 rounds. He's doing a ton of high energy movement and slipping. It takes a lot of physical energy. It takes a lot of mental energy, which also drains you. But he's not someone who was really breaking people with his pace. Like, he was controlling pace. And no one was going to outpace him, but he was also someone that he couldn't exactly, like in the fifth round against Garbrandt, even when Garbrandt was, well, I think it was both a combination of the fact that Dominic Reyes, Jesus, Dominic Cruz isn't that good at, forcing a pace on his opponents, and the fact that I think he was a little bit compromised by the end of that fight. It's hard for him to put enough output to actually, to really get his opponents breaking down. Does that sound right to you?
Yeah, I think you've hit on an interesting dichotomy there between pace and cardio, and I think that's worth expanding on a little bit more. So I look at pace as a tool to make your opponent to lessen their cardio and make sure that yours is higher than theirs, whether or not you have better cardio, whether or not you have like better discrete cardio than them. So if you look at someone like Cain Velasquez, he's often mentioned as a cardio beast, but I don't think his cardio is that great in and of itself. But what's so great about the way he fights is that he makes other guys work harder than he is. And a lot of his game is designed around making you work harder than he's working. He first of all, he starts out pressuring. He'll push you back with a dipping jab, look to control the center of the octagon. So right from the start of the fight, his opponent has to do more work than he does in order to get the positions and to get the distance they want. And then once he runs his primary sequences and works his way into the clinch and works his way on top, everything he does is designed to kind of minimize the amount of effort he has to expend and maximize the amount of effort his opponent has to expend. He uses the control position of the one underhook and the head pin, and then his other arm is free to kind of tie up their bicep, prevent them from moving off, land little shots in the clinch to make them move. And it's the same thing when he's on top. And his wrestling also kind of works that way. He's not shooting like really explosive double legs and making himself do a lot of work. He's not out there shooting like Chad Mendez reactive shots. He's boxing you back to the clinch, maybe ducking in on your hips or maybe just catching an underhook. And then he'll do like a low effort, high crotch thing or a clinch trip. Something that doesn't load a lot of your weight onto him and where he doesn't need to make big explosive movements. And then once he's on the ground, it's the same thing. He's working with consistent ground and pound that's forcing you to move. He's not expending a lot of effort into holding you down. He'll let his opponents move. He has no problem if you like catch an underhook and try to turn into him. He'll go with it and just go around to the back, make you keep moving and hitting you. So it's this consistent way of making his opponent work harder than he is. And you see this a lot from a lot of the more effective fence wrestlers like Khabib, Cain Velasquez, etc., where their kind of game is designed around limiting the amount they have to work. And it has kind of interesting implications for their cardio because they're often looked at as cardio beasts, but also I think they can be gassed if they can be denied their fight. And this hints back to something that the original question pointed out. I have the question right here, and I'll read it off now. We can edit this into the beginning of the segment if we want. But it's from Daniel DeMarco, our friend on Twitter and friend of the site. He says, I'm interested in the exploration of cardio in combat sports, specifically MMA, where I think it is the most difficult to manage. I could be wrong. Who are the best cardio fighters in MMA history? Who are the best fighters at maintaining their cardio? Not necessarily because they're known for good cardio, but because they keep the fight where they want to fight. And just how important is keeping your fight? Possibly with some examples of fighters known for good cardio who are more easily gassed because their preferred fight was taken from them. What are the most impressive two-sided cardio fights we've seen in MMA history, and what made them so impressive in that respect? So like I was saying, Daniel identifies that it's not necessarily about just the amount of cardio you have, but whether you're getting your fight or not. So if somebody can take a guy like Cain Velasquez and strand him on the feet, or take a guy like Khabib and deny him the entries he likes, there's obviously ways to limit someone's cardio, like body punching. You saw Usman was a lot more comfortable late in his fight with Colby because he was working the body early. But not even that, just denying them the sequences they run in order to make their opponent more tired than they are. We saw this with Werdum against Velasquez, where Kane wasn't comfortable wrestling all the time because Werdum's bottom game is obviously very threatening, and he wasn't able to get to his positions in the clinch that he likes because Werdum was using collar ties to tie him up on the inside. He was kneeing him in the body, and he was actively making him work a lot in exchanges. He wasn't just backing up. He would plant and get hit a few times and make Velasquez exchange with him, then go back to the cage and lock up the collar tie and work over his body. And the Mexico thing obviously gets mentioned a lot with that fight, like sea level Kane and all that. But
Yeah.
everything Werdum was doing was preventing him from running that sequence that gasses his opponents and make sure he has a cardio advantage late into the fight. So it's really important to point out that cardio is somewhat a factor of comfort and whether you're getting the fight you want. And you see this not only in cases like those guys, but you'll see fighters a lot of times just get a lot more uncomfortable and gassy when they're forced to fight in an area that they don't want to or that they're not as comfortable. What do you guys think?
I think you brought up a really good point about forcing your opponent into a different kind of fight. And like, this is kind of, again, not to detract from the question too much, but I think there's a lot to be said about not just the amount of cardio you have, quote unquote, but the mental energy that you can expend in that sort of fight. And so, the example that comes to mind is something like, Poirier Holloway too, which is probably the single most insane fight in terms of pace that I've ever seen in MMA. Like, I think together they landed about over 400 strikes, like just unbelievable numbers in that fight. And while Holloway's best moments and where Poirier was able, kind of lost some footing was when he was along the fence. It was still the kind of fight that Poirier is comfortable in, right? But then, I honestly think that Poirier was probably more exhausted by the end of the second round against Khabib than he was by the end of the fifth round against Max. You know what I mean? It's just because Poirier was just totally not prepared to deal with, for whatever reason, he just wasn't prepared to deal with Khabib's kind of fight at all. And so, when he, even in his moment when he stunned Khabib, he just exhausted himself, chasing with these big punches. He wasn't, he was completely ignoring, pretty much everything that had brought him to the title shot in the first place. Whereas the fight with Max, it is an unbelievably violent, and the pace of that fight is just incredible, but it's still a fight where it's the kind of fight that both men know and both men are comfortable with. So by the end of the fifth round, they still look like they have some gas. So a fighter, you guys are gonna hate hearing this, but a fighter, example of someone who is subject to kind of exhausting themselves mentally when they get their fight taken away is someone like RDA. I know that, Ryan, you've talked about how, RDA may have won a couple of the early rounds against Usman, and that he may have done that, but it's also not the kind of fight that you can look at and be like, oh, this isn't going to go well for you over 5. You can just see him kind of going back to these same sort of moves. These, he's sort of willing to concede range more and more. He's, his ability to kind of fend off the takedown is lessening as time goes by. And so by the fifth round, he's just ground into dust. I think he is in some ways a confidence fighter in the sense that he has insane cardio, like we've seen in the Covington fight and the Lawler fight and the Pettis fight. He can go 5 hard rounds, but when you throw kind of wedges into the spokes of his game, I think his his confidence and his pace as a result can wither a bit. What do you think, Sriram?
I think I was actually going to bring up RDA Covington as well, but in a different way, because as you mentioned, it's generally harder to keep the sort of pace that you normally do in a fight that's not your own. And I forgot to develop the Aldo comparison as much as I meant to. I was going to compare Aldo Mendez 2 to Aldo Holloway 1, where Aldo, like, Holloway didn't even do a whole lot in terms of output, at least compared to Aldo Holloway 2, but he just feinted a lot, and Aldo wasn't really ready to deal with an opponent who would just make him react as much as he didn't want to. But I think RDA Covington is one of the more impressive, both fights of cardio and performances of cardio, not just from Covington, but from RDA, because it's not the fight that RDA wants, but it's a fight where RDA was there for the entire fight, doing things that he really didn't want to be in there doing. So, Covington fought a fight specifically to target the points where RDA was weakest, pushing him back just by any means possible, wrestling him more than he wanted to be wrestled. But RDA was there, and he was fresh through most of it. I would say he exhausted through round 3, and then he found like a second win through 4 and 5 when he found more success. And that's kind of the crux of the whole argument, is that once he found some success, he was, rejuvenated, so to speak. So I think, yeah, that's kind of my example for a two-way cardio fight that people might not remember as much, because it's one where it's like, oh, Colby RDA was kind of like Colby Lawler, where Colby just put a work rate on him. But it was one where both guys put up a ton of work in every phase. And that's, I think that'll be my pick for two-way cardio fight.
I have a couple things to add. First of all, I'm back on the topic of fighting against out of your comfort zone, being worse in your cardio than necessarily doing more. I think a perfect example of that is the Conor versus Diaz fights. In the first fight, obviously Conor was constantly trying to close distance. He wanted to pressure Nate and to draw out his punches and to counter him. And early he got the fight he wanted, but it didn't end the way he wanted. He was playing a game that kind of necessitated finishing him early, and he wasn't expecting to get, for probably Nate to counter him so much as he was coming in, for Nate to slip his punches and make him miss or take a lot of heat off by rolling with them. And the second fight, obviously, he reevaluated his expectations. He chose a different fight to want, and that allowed him to play a full 5-round fight. And he had to take, I think he took basically the 4th round off, which is like kind of a really an intelligent decision in terms of managing his cardio. He didn't expect to just walk Nate down and kill him, but he went in there knowing that he had to limit the amount that he throws, and knowing that he was going to get tired and prepared to deal with it. I think there's also an element of, if you want to walk this guy down and put a beating on him, and then it's like round 2 and you suddenly find yourself being like, holy shit, I'm sucking wind, it's probably a lot harder to deal with that than if you've already been there before, and you're going into the fight saying, okay, I know I'm not just going to smash this guy and get him right out of there, but I know I'm going to get tired, and I'm prepared to deal with that. I know what to do when I get tired. I know I can take a break. I know I don't have to keep going and going.
Yeah.
And we see that a lot from guys like Robbie Lawler too. Like, Lawler is a weird example, because I felt that him taking breaks might not be the best for him. He'll often take like 2 or 3 rounds off, and it makes it really hard for him to win fights on the cards, because he's not doing anything for a very large stretch, where I could see it being possible for him to just kind of drop his output a little bit lower throughout the fight, and maybe he wouldn't have to take those off. But he does that so he can punctuate his bursts of aggression with more offense and swarm on guys a lot in the first round and the last 2 rounds. So there's go ahead.
Oh no, I think that's a great example. I was just going to add that Lawler's also a unique example of someone who actually, this is one of the things I love about Robbie Lawler, is he's actually one of the few fighters who knows what it means to throw a round away but not have it be a waste, if you will. So in the first 2 rounds, again, if you watch the first Hendricks fight, like, Lawler throws away the first 2 rounds. Like he doesn't win either of those rounds, but he's still making it hard for Hendricks to land clean on his head, and he's still kind of absorbing the information, trying to make reads, trying to get a beat on his opponent. And then when he actually finds his mark, he really fucks Hendricks up. And that's honestly more of a boxing technique, like to sort of, because there's just a lot more rounds in boxing, and you can afford to start slow and then ramp up, or if you're someone like Floyd Mayweather, you just have a system that takes care of it, and you can build up a huge lead, and then late in the fight you can actually give rounds away and not be in any kind of fear that you're going to lose. And we just don't see that in MMA.
Early rounds. Yeah.
Aldo,
Go ahead.
Dominic, that sort of thing.
But yeah, or you can do stuff like give away the first 3 rounds in order to get reads on your opponent, to figure out his likely patterns of offense and to build a plan to defend against them. But like you said, you can't really do that in MMA just because of the rounds. And I think guys like Lawler who punctuate who kind of conserve their cardio in a really steep way in order to allow themselves to do these like big bursts of aggression for a short time, really suffer from MMA judging, because first of all, you can't expect judges to like correctly assess what's landing in close exchanges. You need to have a consistent output of volume, or just prevent your opponent from doing like anything that looks like punching you. And when you do have these bursts that Lawler does, you're not going to get 10-8s that you often might deserve. So it's questionable maybe whether it's useful for him to go all out in 1 or 2 rounds against Hendricks instead of going like 60% in 3 or 4 rounds. But the other thing, go ahead.
Oh yeah, I actually take a little bit of umbrage with that, because it's worth saying that Lawler wasn't a fighter who actually, I don't want to make it just about Robbie Lawler, but he's a good example of this for this discussion. I don't think Lawler was someone who actually ended up losing those decisions very often.
He didn't, but he easily could have.
Oh, I think I agree with you there. Like it's a risky gambit, and there's no doubt that it's a risky gambit, but it's also notable that he made it work. Like he made it work against Roy McDonald in their first fight. He made it work against, he almost made it work against Hendricks. There's an example of it falling short, but he made it work against Hendricks in the rematch. He made it work against Condit, just barely. He even made it work against Cerrone. So I think that, but he is also someone whose advantages in exchanges are quite pronounced. Like when he, if Lawler wins an exchange, it's very clear that he wins it. Because he hits incredibly hard in his positioning, a whole bunch of other things. I agree that it is not necessarily an optimal strategy for the metagame. As we've seen in the last couple of years, we had fighters like Whitaker and Holloway be a lot more moment to moment in their approaches, and we still do. It's just we don't tend to see guys be willing to, or just have the comfort in throwing a round or 2 away just to get a read on what their opponent's doing. Sriram, do you have something you wanted to add?
Yeah, I think a good example of what Ryan meant in terms of throwing fights away, because Lawler didn't exactly lose that sort of decision. But if you look at the Donald Cerrone fight, which was right around the time where Lawler started to his burst became more pronounced in a way that you could tell that his cardio was kind of going and his game was kind of going overall. But he took the entirety of the second round off. And I think that hurt him more than it should have. I remember thinking he won that fight fairly clearly, 1-3. But you could also see that, one, it was a split decision, which someone with Robbie Lawler's game, shouldn't be getting against Donald Cerrone. And 2, it kind of just made really clear that Robbie Lawler was kind of done. Because if you're going to work in those sorts of very, very obvious bursts, you should have at least hurt Donald Cerrone more than you did. So I think Robbie Lawler probably could have benefited a little bit more from the consistent volume approach that you guys mentioned from someone like Holloway, but it's also worth noting that he probably wasn't capable of working with that sort of consistency. So I think it's just, something to work around in terms of their own cardio limitations. Because there are some people who they can recover entirely with one round off. And Robbie Lawler was that kind of fighter who, if he took 2 rounds off, he was back 4 and 5 with a vengeance, worse than ever. So I think, someone like Jose Aldo, on the other hand, it's if he gassed, even if he didn't do anything in the first 2 rounds against Volkanovski and he was shot, but that's a decent example, he didn't really have anything to offer in round 3 either. So I think it's a weird sort of thing. I think Lawler picked a decent fighting style in terms of flow of the fight for how he worked. It's just not necessarily optimal for everyone.
Yeah,
But
I
with the
think
Lawler
some.
thing,
Oh, go ahead, Ryan.
with the Lawler point, it was less about Lawler specifically and more about the general concept of burst offense in MMA. That Lawler
Oh yeah,
got
yeah.
a lot of decisions that could have easily gone the other way, but in terms of like consistently winning fights, there's some problems with it in terms of the MMA meta.
Yeah, I think that's burst offense is the right way to put it. And I think it's also something that's just kind of worth considering with cardio is some of it depends on we are drifting a little bit off, but I think it's all relevant information. It does depend on just who you are as a fighter. Like Lawler is someone who never really cared about decisions. Like I don't think Lawler ever went into a single fight thinking I have a game plan to win a decision in this fight. I think he was someone who's just like, I'm just going to go out and fight, and I know that I can fight because I know that I'm better than they are in a fight. And it's, again, it's kind of amazing that he made that work, and I think he compiled that with a lot of tactical advantages as well. But that would, he was walking a fine line with that sort of approach. Whereas someone like Aldo, through his reign, Aldo was a lot more was really focused on controlling the fight. And he was, maybe the best ring general that we've ever seen in MMA, in the sense that he could just effortlessly shut down his opponents from really enforcing a pace. And that was, while fighters like, a good example is like Aldo versus Edgar, right? Because going into the first fight, people were like, oh, it's going to be, like Aldo's takedown defense versus, Edgar's cardio, right? And in the end, it was really just, as Phil McKenzie put, ended up just being Edgar's boxing against Aldo's much better boxing. And that Edgar's nominal cardio advantage, he wasn't able to leverage that in any kind of significant way. So he was still fighting a fight that was less comfortable to him. And he wasn't, that cardio advantage just wasn't there.
I think the last thing I'm going to say on this topic, and it ties into what you said about Aldo, in terms of two-way cardio fights that we talked about, the two that stand out most to me are Max Poirier, as you mentioned, and Dos Anjos versus Ferguson. And I think they both reveal an important point about fights like that. If you look at those fights and all 4 fighters in them, they're all 5-round fighters. They're not going in there with the intention to finish their opponents. Like some of them have games that are geared toward finishes, Poirier and Ferguson specifically, but they're not like Connor where they're kind of banking on a finish. Ferguson does a ton of attritional damage and just kind of like tries to fuck his opponent's faces and bone structure up. But they have processes that allow them to get the finish while also making sure that they're ready in rounds 4 and 5. But if you look at guys like this, they're not like power punchers, or they're not power punchers all the time. Poirier is probably the most out of these, but most of his shots are like picking jabs or light throwaway punches that are designed to make you move in a specific way or draw out a reaction so he can make his hard punches count. And Max and Ferguson are kind of similar in that they almost don't throw a lot of hard punches. Or Ferguson, when he does throw hard punches, they'll be like that kind of square jab, the jab he does from a square stance where he like thrusts out his shoulder a lot harder than a typical jab, but it's not a super committed punch that takes a lot out of him. They layer offense and they build it in a way that they're kind of like specifically programming it to go 5 rounds. And it's an interesting contrast to a fighter like Aldo, because if you fight like Max does, like Ferguson does, you're going to take a lot more damage because they're Aldo wasn't even a fighter who finished fights a lot, and he would usually go 5 rounds. But when you're playing that kind of game where you know you're going to go 5 rounds and you're trying to drag your opponents into deep water, you need to make sure that they work as hard or harder than you. So Max and Ferguson, they're constantly peppering volume onto their opponents, feinting to draw out counters and making them work. But they're also right in there, fencing off with them, battling it out in the pocket, and Poirier too to a degree. And when you do that, it'll leave you in a much better position late in the fight if you're a guy like Max and Ferguson and Poirier who has that cardio advantage to layer. But it also might lead to a shorter run at the top and maybe a shorter career. We're already kind of seeing that with Max a little bit, where he looks more tentative and he's not as comfortable taking shots in the pocket because he often relied on that cardio advantage a lot, and he never really developed enough defense to have that advantage and to drag guys into deep water without taking shots. And we've discussed Ferguson a lot, and a lot of us think that he's kind of starting to go the same way, where he's not showing the hesitancy that Max is, but he's seems to be starting a physical decline, although that could be to do with age too. And guys like Aldo, well, they don't have that ability to like push their opponents into deep water and to make sure that their opponent is more tired than them as the fight goes on. Like you mentioned, he's an incredible ring general, and he kind of takes the opposite tact, where his game is designed around not letting guys do that to him. He kind of achieves the goal of being a 5-round fighter, but in a much different way, where instead of trying to leverage a cardio advantage, he's trying to make an opponent's cardio advantage not matter. And it's interesting to see, because I discussed this in the big Aldo article I wrote, but you don't see a lot of nullifying skill sets in MMA that are designed like around preventing volume and preventing exchanges.
Yeah.
And
it's just do
now
more.
that Aldo's aging out, yeah, no, it's the meta is geared very heavily towards volume and consistent pace. And now that Aldo's aging out, I don't know if the sport really has anyone like that who shapes their game around kind of denying their opponent the ability to leverage any kind of cardio or volume advantage.
Someone like Valentina Shevchenko might apply to that.
Oh God,
just a
yeah.
Very
women's MMA.
Yeah,
I mean,
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think the most extreme example of what.
Too.
Yeah, I think the most extreme example of what you mentioned with Max, and it's not really at a comparable skill level, but you can look at someone like Michael Bisping, who he never really developed any sort of defense whatsoever at all. But he was forced just by the nature of his game to walk into the buzzsaw over and over because his only edge was volume and pace. I think you might see something like that with Ferguson, just against, like, he has better defense than Michael Bisping ever did, but it's also that you're going to see better boxers than Bisping faced do more things to Ferguson, because like if you try to do that against someone like Dustin Poirier or Conor McGregor, even if your edge is pace, you're going to be in the line of fire more than it might help you to be.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that's a good kind of place to leave the discussion, is that I hope, I'm sure we all hope, that that we will see someone in the coming years who is gearing their game towards MMA the same way that Aldo did, where it is they recognize that, hey, I don't have to put an insane amount of output out all the time. If I gear my game towards limiting the output of my opponent, I can actually make some strides as well. So we got a hell of a lot of mileage out of just 2 topics, I must say.
I think the most interesting one is the next one, though.
Oh, Sandro's divorce, or his parents' divorce.
You got the question?
Yeah, go for it, Ryan.
This is from our patron, Alessandro Scazzero, who, by the way, we have no affiliation with. I don't know this guy at all. Never heard of him in my life. He just randomly signed up for our Patreon out of nowhere. The question is, Why did my parents get a divorce? What did I do wrong? Danny, would you like to start?
I would love to start. Thank you, Ryan. Sandro, hey, thank you for the question, buddy. Advice to you: get your gains game up, man. I think you're looking a little soft. I think I think your parents are just kind of noticing that your gym schedule's dwindling. It's not really getting your full attention. So I don't know how they're supposed to love you if you don't really put your full effort into it. So that's my advice for you, man. Good luck. Yeah, start deadlifting, start squatting more, maybe, up the bench press. You're just kind of looking a little bit narrow. I don't know how else to say it.
Yeah, I think they really wanted a kid who was more like his sister, and
Absolutely.
he didn't really fit the bill there. And
Truly.
I guess in revenge, they decided that you deserve to be disappointed across 2 Christmases rather than just one.
But don't give up, man.
I-
This is we're here for you. Like, please chart your progress and just keep sending us money at the fight site, and we'll keep answering your questions. So don't you worry.
Yes, if anyone wants more personalized gems of wisdom like this, it's only $5.
Not only fight analysts, we're life analysts.
Yeah, and this is really where we make our hay.
When they say $50 for the scouting, we'll scout your personal life and come back with solutions.
We'll fix your Tinder profile.
Yeah. Oh shit! Shut up. I think we're good on this, guys. Do you agree?
Yeah, I think we thoroughly covered everything.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for listening. We should be back next week. Whatever way the main event goes, we'll be talking about it. Yeah, especially Sandro. Please keep us posted. And we'll be back next week to follow up on the main event. And again, thank you guys, and keep listening.
Yep. Join us next time. Thanks for joining us, Ryan.
Thanks for having me.